Hi, my name is Charlie Nisley, and I'm a Part C state contact here in MSIP, as well as an audit facilitator for Judith Gregorian's team, Team B, in MSIP. I have a great deal of experience in working with internal controls as they relate to the audit processes, and specifically how states are fixing different issues that were identified by auditors in the single audit process. And I also had some time to work upstairs here in the department with Ellen in the Office of Chief Financial Officer, and to spend some time looking internally at risk assessment within the department. So as a sort of occupational hazard, I tend to see internal controls in just about everything, including just on the walk here, there's a printer on the way, and as you can imagine, most offices, there's issues around printers breaking, printers running out of toner, things like this. So there's a big sign on our printer, and it indicates that you shouldn't use it as a copier. You should only use it to print things, right? Use the copier to copy. So seems innocuous enough, but in looking at that, I see a number of things. I see someone doing a risk assessment and looking at the likelihood and the impact, right? So we look at that printer and we say, well, what's the likelihood that someone's going to use it in a way that it wasn't meant to be used, right? Are they going to make 12 copies of a 50-page document using the printer? And we know what happens when that happens. Well, I think there's a fair amount of likelihood. So someone did the math and said, yeah, you know, it's easy just to hit the button and make that number of copies. So it's a likely thing to happen, right? The impact of that, of course, are some of the things I mentioned, right? The printer's going to break more often. It's not going to be available for other people. And there's going to be costs associated with both. So looking at the likelihood and the impact, they decided, well, we need to take some action, right? These are the internal controls for the actions, activities that you're going to take to make sure that the printer's only used in a way that it should be used. In this case, what do they decide on? The sign, right? So my brain always goes to whether or not that activity is going to be sufficient to ensure the appropriate use of the printer. I'm thinking probably not. Well, what else could be done? So what other control activities would make sense? Maybe we could move the printer closer to the office manager, right? So there's some additional oversight of the printer, so people have to go near that person. Or maybe there's some hardwired limitation that you could put in the printer or in the computers not to allow people to do that. So what would be some additional actions? And then again, how are you going to continue to monitor the use of the printer to make sure that that's happening? What would be some ways that you could do that to see were those activities that you put in place effective? So maybe we would look at the amount of paper being used by that printer, how long the toner cartridges are lasting, to see if it's having the desired effect. And then I think there's even this sort of environmental aspect to internal controls, right? Are you working in an office where people understand that or value getting the very most they can out of the paper and the money and the resources that go into making sure those things are available, and the inconvenience potentially in what they're doing to other people in the office? So is there a culture in the office that sort of respects that, and that it's a cheaper option and a more efficient option to use the copier? So those are the things I think about when I walk by a printer. Sorry, I'm going to torture you for the next few minutes to talk a little bit more about internal controls and to talk about some ways that they relate to us within the IDEA programs. As Ellen mentioned in her presentation, internal controls was formally referenced just very briefly under the EDGAR requirements for financial management systems. It now has its very own regulation and some expanded requirements in the OMB uniform guidance in 2 CFR 200-303. The OMB uniform guidance also includes reference to the Government Accountability Office standards for internal controls in the federal government. And that accompanying document is really very helpful. It presents the 5 components of internal controls in a very approachable manner. It also has a number of additional elements. I think there are 17 additional elements that can be examined underneath each of those more general components. I'd also like to note that the OMB uniform guidance includes regulations related to one specific component, and that's the risk assessment, which is, of course, one of the 5 components that's going to be covered in greater detail by Susan Murray in her presentation. But I did want to make sure that I mention that the requirements in the OMB circular include requirements for the U.S. federal government to perform risk assessments, as well as for state pass-through entities to perform risk evaluations of their subrecipients. The IDEA example that I'd like to talk about with regard to the GAO internal control standards is vulnerable assets. And these are devices many times, such as laptops, tablets, assistive technology devices, things that are often used within special ed, both programs, and what types of controls there need to be in place for those things. Now, by definition, most of these don't meet the standards for equipment, so they are priced at less than $5,000, and so as a result of that, they don't have to meet the standards in EDGAR and in the Uniform Guidance for Equipment. So there are different inventorying requirements there that would apply. So the question becomes, well, what do we have to do for these devices? Clearly, there still needs to be accountability. So we need to make sure that we know that those devices are being used appropriately and that we know where they are and that they've been secured for program use. So the GAO standards address this very specifically. I think, again, what that does as an accompanying document is goes beyond what's available around internal controls in the uniform guidance. It provides some additional detail about more specific things. And this was one very good example. And we were able to provide some support based on what we knew about program as well as what the GAO standards provided. Where internal controls and reasonable assurance are concerned, the point of emphasis I'd like to make for the IDEA program is that when we talk about internal controls and reasonable assurance, this is really very different than most of the compliance type indicators that you look at in your daily life. So in this regard, this is going to be a little different than your normal work. Reasonable assurance is what we're looking for internal controls. And it makes sense when you consider sort of a cost-benefit analysis, right? We're not talking about kids here. Let's go back to the example of the vulnerable assets. You don't want to put a system in place that almost by definition is so complicated, time-consuming, and expensive that it outweighs the actual value of the devices that you're trying to protect. So what you'll likely find is a system that's a little less than what you would for those pieces of equipment, but that still maintains some integrity and some accountability for those devices. So it's really finding a balance here, finding something that makes sense. So in this image, you're looking at GAO standards for internal control in the federal government. This is the cube, is what we like to call it. It was previously depicted as a pyramid, and on the bottom was sort of the control environment leading up to a peak that had monitoring activities at the top. And I like this depiction a little bit better for a number of reasons. First of all, it puts sort of everything on an even plane. Although I can see why environment might sort of underlie everything. In this regard, we're sort of looking at everything as if it's equally important. But the part that I'd like to talk about here that Ellen really didn't get as much of a chance to discuss in her presentation is the top of the cube. Because what I think is done there when we talk about operations, reporting, and compliance, this is where we really make those connections to program. This is what speaks to IDEA. Operations is the IDEA program. These are the types of activities that you do in your daily basis. So this may be things like your subrecipient grant application reviews, dispute resolution, or other general supervisory responsibilities, right? These are your operations. These are the things you do on a daily basis. The reporting, again, very easy. These are the things that you would do through your 618 reporting or your APR reporting to OSEP. And then compliance as well. And this is not looking in your subrecipient monitoring. This is your own compliance. What is the state's compliance with different federal laws and different grant assurances that you've given? The other thing that I'd like to point out is that the cube has depth. And when you look at depth, you're really looking, they talk about sort of the entity level in the cube all the way through sort of a very specific function level. And I think that's really important when we look at special ed as well. We're going to look at what's called an accessible unit. That's what you would call it in internal controls. But for us, what that means is that you could look at a specific function within the IDEA program. You could also look at a smaller portion of a much larger function, but that part that falls within the purview of the IDEA program. So an example of that might be procurement. And there are a certain amount of the approvals that would happen just within the office, the authorizations, that part of the process that you might just examine that, just what's within your control to evaluate and, for internal controls. So for the next few moments, I'd like to talk about each of the components individually of internal controls. And the first one we'll talk about is the control environment. I think Ellen did a very good job of sort of talking about the general concepts of environment. So things like the climate and tone of the organization, how the integrity and values of the people that work within it, and the basic commitment to competence of that program. These are all sort of organizational, and they come from leadership, and they need to be instilled throughout the staff, sort of at every level. The IDEA connection that I'd like to make with regard to control environment is it's this commitment to competence. And I think as we look at improvement activities in general in states through the APR process, and specifically within the SIP process, I think what we see here is this dedication towards training staff, building capacity so that state staff at all levels are better able to improve results for children with disabilities. The next element of internal control that we're going to talk about is the risk assessment. Now, Ellen's presentation referenced a number of the criteria typically examined during a risk assessment, and Susan Murray's presentation is going to go into a lot greater depth about risk assessment in general, and what types of factors the department and MSIP is viewing with regard to risk with our grantees. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but there are always a couple things with this topic that I make sure and emphasize whenever I have the opportunity. The first of these relates to risk and vulnerability. And I think there's a tendency with people who don't work in internal controls all the time to look at risk as a bad thing. When we talk about something being risky, there's a tendency to think something's wrong, that there's non-compliance. And so my role right now is just to say that's not always the case. And I wanted to use an IDEA example of this concept. And it relates to complexity, which I know was mentioned during Ellen's presentation. So for IDEA purposes, a complex system would be an SEA or a lead agency that had numerous LEAs or EIS programs, right? So that means there's a lot more moving parts when they go to do their general supervision, when they go to monitor, or when they're doing grant application reviews. So that in and of itself adds complexity. There's risk. And the reason there's risk goes back to my printer example from earlier. What's the likelihood of something happening? The more EIS providers we have, the more LEAs there are, the greater the number of opportunities, right, for something to go wrong. Doesn't mean something's going to go wrong. In fact, many of the states we work with who are larger states, receive larger sums of money, and have more subrecipients are very complex systems as well that are able to accommodate that type of complexity and make sure that things continue to go right. But it does need to be viewed as risk, and we do need to take a closer examination of it, I think. The next level we're going to talk about relates to control activities, and those are just the actions that we take to address those risks that we've identified through the risk assessment. Control activities should be driven by those risks, the likelihood, the impact, right? I talked a little bit about likelihood, but remember, another factor we want to look at is the impact. So what if things do go wrong, what's the worst that could happen is sort of what I always think when it comes to impact. The printer, obviously, the impact would be very minor or, at best, right? So you're in position, there's a small sum of money that's cost if the machine breaks or the additional toner or paper. In our work, when we're talking about the types of money that we send to our subrecipients and potential misuse, I think there could be much higher impact that we need to look at. And those are the systems that you really want to spend time developing, are the ones where the impact could be great financially. It could result in something like an audit finding. And then I know that when Ellen talks, she always talks about the front page of the Washington Post as well, that potential impact that there'd be embarrassment to the program over the way funds were spent or the way children were treated. So I think when we look at impact, you want to make sure you're dedicating a lot of your time to those things where the impact could be very great, not just likelihood. Things could be likely to happen, but have a very minor impact. We need to look at those things that are both likely and would have a large impact on the program. Ellen's presentation also talks a great deal about preventative control activities and detective control activities. And I always take the opportunity to talk about the importance of those preventative activities. I think in IDEA programs, most of us come from special ed backgrounds and we're former teachers. So I think we understand the value of those preventative things that can be done to make sure that issues don't happen down the line. And the one that I really want to focus on primarily is training and capacity building. By teaching people how to do their jobs, by teaching staff how to implement evidence-based practices, you can have a more desirable result later on. Also keep undesirable effects from happening in the future as well, just by making sure that people are properly trained. I think that similarly, if you have approval processes in place, if you have segregation of duties, other preventative actions, it can keep negative things like audit findings from happening, which are much less pleasant dealing with on the back end. Information and communication was discussed by Ellen. These are the systems that are used by state for the identification and the exchange of information in a way and in a time frame that enables people to carry out their responsibilities. So for IDEA, again, I think this is a very easy connection to make. And I want to emphasize one particular part of information and communication, and that's with regard to documentation. And as I do work in internal controls, as I do audit work, it's amazing how often issues come down to documentation and whether there's documentation to support, whether it's the allowable use of funds or how a decision was made. So I can't emphasize enough this need in terms of how you communicate, making sure there's documentation to support, again, decisions that are made there in the program. Where your IDEA and SIP processes are concerned, I think it's also to look at communication as it relates to the program itself, how people are communicating within the program, as well as potentially across different government agencies. So I think this is something you want to examine. You want to look at the effectiveness of that communication and make sure that things are going well. I even think about this with regard to communication with stakeholders as well. The last piece of the cube that we're going to discuss today is monitoring. And these are the processes that an agency will use to look at how an internal controls system or internal controls activity is actually functioning, compared to how it should be functioning. There are a couple different types of monitoring that can be done. There's just sort of ongoing monitoring that occurs, as well as sort of separated or targeted evaluations like audits. When we talk about IDEA programs, I think it's worth mentioning that monitoring is used in a very different context in internal controls. When we talk about monitoring in a program, we're talking about monitoring our subrecipients, monitoring EIS programs, monitoring LEAs. When we talk about monitoring in the context of internal controls, we're talking about monitoring the effectiveness of those control activities that you've put in place. So this could be anything from programmatic to IT issues. I think about making sure, for example, that people who no longer should have access to a computer system being removed. Their permissions are being removed on a timely basis. So you'd want to make sure that maybe you do a test transaction. You see, well, somebody recently left their position. If we tried to log on as that person, would we still have access to the information that person had access to? So again, just making sure, going back and testing those internal controls and making sure that they're working the way they're supposed to work. Test transactions was something that was not long ago used by the FBI actually to look at Travel Safety Administration, TSA, and you may have remembered this from the newspapers not long ago. They sent a number of FBI agents, they tested the TSA by just running through with a number of weapons or whatever else they went through with. And again, test transactions you could use. There are other ways, obviously, that we all monitor whether we're getting proper approval processes in the procurement system, or whether appropriate signatures are being obtained, whether there's parent participation on IFSPs or IEPs. So these are all things that you can examine. Well, how do we know what we did is working? How do we know that the printer isn't being used to make copies as I speak to you now? And I think these are the types of questions you ask. And again, as we look at our SIPs, I know everyone right now is looking at evaluation. How are we evaluating the effectiveness of those evidence-based practices that we're putting in place? So similarly with internal controls, there's this ongoing evaluation, the plan, do, review. So it's unfortunately not something you're ever done with. When you are finished, just when you think you're finished with your internal controls, something changes, right? There's some new need, there's something new that you need to control, or there's some other, something else catches fire, I always like to say, but there's shifting priorities. Thank you for taking the time to listening to this portion of the presentation. I wanted to point out also that if you have questions related to the application of internal controls to your specific program or to programs in general, you can post them to the discussion board, and myself and my colleagues here in OSEP will be taking a look at those questions and responding to them in the interactive session. Thanks again.